Join the coven. I think I accidentally joined a cult. Part 4. A story written by the Globetrotter. I've made a horrible mistake. I should have never talked to David in the first place. I'm an idiot. Lily, if you're reading this, I love you so much. I'm sorry. Yesterday morning, I had woken up with a newfound happiness. I gave Lily a kiss and let her know that I had been fired from my delivery job. She seemed fairly upset, but understanding. I planned on heading back out and applying for a new job. Not every place in this town was going to be a cult, right? A few hours after I'd posted the last update on Monday, I'd received a call from Henry. He was looking for some answers, for a reason behind me deciding that we both had to quit. He was persistent at first, even telling me that we had to go back to work today. But I eventually forced him to agree to not show up to work the next day. That is why I was confused when I saw Henry's name appear on my cell phone screen yesterday morning. I answered the call, hesitant at first. Henry? I started, ready to argue with my old friend. Hey, Tom, he said, sounding calm. I'm sorry about how I acted last night. I cleared my throat. No, that's cool, man. I understand where you were coming from. Henry grunted in agreement. I was going to see if you wanted to hang out today. I sighed. Remember how that gone the first time. Yeah, man, that'd be cool. I was thinking you could bring Lily along, he said, tapping on what sounded like a wooden table. I was gonna bring Hannah along. I smiled. Well, actually, Lily has a job interview today, I said, glancing at Lily. Can we put this off for some other day? I could hear Henry sigh through the phone. Today is the only day Hannah has free for a while, he said. It's cool if Lily can't come. I nodded, understanding where he was going. Well, where are we going? Want me to just drive there? No, that's cool, man. I'll just come pick you up, he said. All right, Henry. See you in a few then, I said, hanging up the phone. Lily was suddenly behind me. What was that about? I heard my name. Oh, Henry wants to hang out today, I said. Sounds like he wanted you to meet Hannah. She frowned. Who? Henry's girlfriend, I said, stepping aside as she walked towards the door. Oh, she said, giving me a kiss goodbye. Well, apologize for me, please. I said goodbye and sat on the front porch, waiting for Henry to come get me. Those few minutes of being alone gave me time to look back over the previous few days. I had been stupid, careless. I couldn't be like that anymore. Lily deserved better. Henry's car pulled into my apartment's driveway. I jogged down the steps by the front door and waved to my friend, his passenger seat noticeably empty. I opened the car door, nodding to my friend. Hey, man, where's Hannah? He grunted. We're about to go pick her up, he said, looking anxiously over his shoulder. Do you mind? It took me a few seconds to take the hint. Oh, yeah, man, of course, I said, closing the passenger's side door and setting myself down in the back seat. How far away does Hannah live? I asked, buckling my seatbelt. And where are we even going? Henry shrugged. Not too far, and I don't know yet. he said, making eye contact through the rear-view mirror. I thought we'd decide when we picked Hannah up. I nodded. Yeah, that makes sense, I said, looking out the window as we pulled away from my apartment. Henry chuckled, his eyes glued to the road. It'll be a good day. I'm sure it will, I said, feeling suddenly anxious. Hey, no hard feelings with the job thing, right? Henry seemed annoyed for a moment after I brought it up. No, man, we're good. Don't worry about it. I nodded. That's good, I said, looking back out of my window. I just got some really weird vibes from the place, that's all. Henry didn't respond verbally. He simply nodded, turning onto the next road on our way to Hannah's house. The rest of the ride was mostly silent. I was surprised when we pulled into the driveway of Hannah's house. She sat on the steps in front of her door, a smile crossing her face as she hopped down towards the car. She pulled open the passenger side door, sitting beside Henry. Hey, she said, giving Henry a kiss on the cheek. She looked to be only around 20 years old, and she was pretty. I'm fully aware that looks aren't everything, as they really aren't. But this girl was way out of Henry's league, at least in the physical sense. We made eye contact as Hannah put on her seatbelt. She gasped, turning to Henry. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. Who is that? I frowned. Henry looked over his shoulder at me. Oh, you know, my friend Thomas? I've told you about him. He really wanted to come along today to meet you, you know? He said, giving me a look. Right, Tom? I slowly nodded, unsure of what to say. Yeah. Hannah smiled. Oh, well, it's nice to finally meet you, Tom. I gave a polite smile, unsure of what to say. Hannah looked to her boyfriend. Well, I only booked 2 seats in the reservations, so... I'll figure something out, Henry said, pulling out of Hannah's driveway. Hannah spoke throughout the entirety of the drive, her boyfriend absently nodding as she did so. I watched as Henry pulled the car onto a familiar road. My heart rate started to increase. What was going on? Was this some sort of surprise? He had told me he didn't know where we were going. Maybe Hannah was just confused. How did she not know that she would be seeing me today? Had I ever given Henry my address? Henry pulled the car into the parking lot of David's warehouse. Hannah looked out of her window, confused. Where are we? She asked, turning to Henry. Did we take a wrong turn? I may or may not be hiding something from you, he said, glancing to me. Trust me, he'll love it. She smiled. Oh, a surprise, she said, turning to me. Did you know about this? I couldn't respond. What were we doing here? What the hell were we doing here? Henry and Hannah were already outside of the car by the time I snapped back into reality. I had to stop this. I threw open the car door, nearly falling out. Hannah, run! I said, running towards her. She stopped, turning to look at me. What? Henry was staring directly at me. Tom, what's wrong with you? I ignored him. Hannah, you need to freaking leave now. What are you talking about? She said, likely more afraid of me than anything else. She turned to her boyfriend. What is he talking about, Henry? Henry stood in silence for a moment, staring directly into my eyes. In them, I could see pain. I was really hoping you wouldn't do that, Tom. Hannah looked back at me, a look of terror in her eyes. She screamed. Last thing I remember was feeling a sharp pain on the back of my skull, and the sight of the ground as it came up to meet me. I'm not really sure what time it was when I woke up. I heard someone speak as I sat completely still, my eyes still shut. Laughter surrounded me, and my eyes began to peel open. I was in a large room, men standing in front of me. They wore black robes and had smiles across their faces. I recognized one of them as one of the workers I had seen in the warehouse a few days before. The warehouse. Fear suddenly returned to my body as my brain began to catch up to the surroundings. The room was full of men, all of them dressed in dark robes. There had to be 100 of them, at least. I tried to stand, but quickly realized that I had been restrained. I was tied to a chair, the ropes keeping my hands behind me. I tried to wiggle back and forth, but it seemed that the chair had been nailed to the floor or something. I wasn't going anywhere. I scanned the crowd, unable to comprehend that I wasn't going to find someone who can help me. I nearly screamed when I saw Hannah. She was completely naked, tied up on something that looked like a table on its side. She was spread out like a starfish, her mouth gagged. A man stood in front of her, his black robe highlighted by the red collar around his neck. "The time has come," David said, making sure to keep his eyes locked on me. "Within the next few minutes, we will be faced with the Lord himself." A deafening applause filled the room. I looked around, trying to find Henry. He was nowhere to be seen. "With this 47th sacrifice, our Father will return and take us with him to the afterlife," he said, turning to Hannah. "And when he is done, he will return once more to rid the earth of the rest." The men in the room cheered once more. I wasn't too familiar with cult sacrifices, but this wasn't how I would imagine one would go. "The time has come to be rewarded for our unending devotion to the Lord and to the evil who opposed him," he concluded, looking to me. "Eternal suffering." With that final statement, David spun, pulling a knife out of his pocket. Hannah became visibly terrified, trying to pull herself from her inevitable grave. Her eyes met with mine, the only friendly pair in the room. My hands repeatedly pulled against the rope, attempting to break free. My wrists were beginning to burn, but I didn't care. David stood before Hannah, tears filling her eyes. He pushed the tip of his knife into her upper arm as he spoke to her, his words inaudible to me. Though her mouth was covered, I could still hear her scream as blood trickled down her arm. I felt one of my hands come through the rope, suddenly. It was still stuck in the tangled mess, but it was progress. David looked to his left, holding the knife out, away from him. My stomach dropped as Henry stepped forward, taking the knife in his hand. Hannah had a similar reaction. Her eyes widened and her screams became louder. I hate to think of what her moments were like. in that moment. Henry stepped behind Hannah, no signs of remorse on his face. He placed the knife up to Hannah's throat, the girl becoming even more agitated. I couldn't watch. I turned my head, squeezing my eyes shut. Seconds of silence went by. "Wait!" a voice called, making me turn towards the front of the room. David was staring directly at me. "I want him to watch," he said, a man suddenly approaching me from the crowd. "I want him to see what he is going to miss." I instantly recognized the man from the video of Ashley. From my window. His large hands gripped the sides of my head as he stood behind me, angling my head towards Hannah. I tried to shut my eyes, but his fingers nearly ripped my eyelids open. David smiled, nodding to Henry. Henry stared at me for a moment before sliding the knife across Hannah's neck. Hannah did not break eye contact with me as her neck was cut open. Her screams came further and further apart as the life was drained from her. I realized too late that I could still move my eyeballs. I looked away, the man behind me likely too focused on Hannah to notice. The room stood in silence as Hannah slowly died. I reluctantly looked back to the front of the room. Hannah's head now hung against her chest, unmoving. Henry stood, a bloody knife in his hand, and a smile on his face. I needed to find a way to leave. Now! I didn't want to see what happened when the group realized that this was all a sick lie. I squinted, my eyes in pain, as a sharp ringing began to fill my head. I shook my head, noticing that the man was no longer holding on to me. I turned, seeing the man knelt down on the ground, his head in his hands. Every person in the room was on their knees, screaming in pain and gripping their skulls. My eyes began to darken slightly. Have you ever stood too quickly, and you felt as if you were on the brink of passing out? That sensation now filled my body continuously. The men in the room seemed to feel the same way. Some fell all the way to the ground, while others simply remained in their original positions. As I was in a chair, I was able to sit upright, though I struggled to keep my head from falling. At the front of the room, Henry sat, fallen behind Hannah's corpse. David was knelt in front of her, struggling to stand. Thick black smoke rose from the floor in front of Hannah. I watched in horror as the cloud grew, hovering in front of Hannah. A strange hissing sound emanated from the cloud, drowning out any other sound in the room. David pushed himself slowly from the ground as the cloud floated toward him. He stumbled slightly, gaining his balance as he spoke. "It is an honor to finally meet you, my lord," he said, his hands on his chest. "I am David, and I..." A loud, wet crack filled the room as David's head was ripped in half at the mouth. The top half of his head was flung towards the back of the room, smacking against the wall and landing on the floor. The remainder of David's body fell limp on the ground, a large pool of blood already spilling from the corpse's open throat. The room stared in silence as the cloud of smoke moved slowly towards the next cult member. The man stood, smiling, with his arms out. Several men in the room ran in a panic, likely afraid of whatever this thing was. I tugged at the ropes with my free hand as the smoke cloud met with the man, his head spinning around nearly the entire way as his body fell to the floor. I could feel blood seeping from my wrists as I essentially tore my hands from their constraints. But I didn't care. The Lord moved slowly to his next target as I fumbled with the ropes at my ankles. The room was silent, full of men waiting for their ticket to the afterlife. Outside of this room, however, the sounds of men yelling in fear could be heard. I untied myself from the chair, falling to the floor. I took one last look at the creature before sprinting for the doorway, leaping over David's severed head. I found myself in the poorly lit room, the one that David had left Henry and I in just a few days before. I could hear men screaming in the hallway that led to the stairs to the warehouse. I made one of the worst choices I've ever made. I ran to the only familiar part of the room I felt safe in. I ripped open the door to the closet that sat in the secluded corner of the room. I stepped inside, looking one last time towards the carnage before shutting the door behind me. I type to you now from my phone. There's essentially no connection down here. I doubt this will even post. I've started to question my religious choices. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. I've started to question my sanity. I'm not sure that any of this is real anymore. I'm not sure if you are real reading this. But here I am. Talking to you is the only thing I can do to feel distracted. I tried to call Lily. The call didn't go through. I left her a voicemail. I don't want to go over what I said to you. This is probably my final message to you. I can't see this ending well for me. Maybe I could have made it. Maybe I could have reached the door. But I came for this freaking closet. That's my life, I guess. Me and my bad, horrible choices. I'd ask for luck right now. But who am I really kidding? Part 5. The final chapter. I sat in that closet for nearly an hour after posting my last update. The screaming coming from the depths of the cult's basement had begun to die down by the time I had stepped through the door. There was nobody to be seen. I saw the body of a large man laying on the floor by the room where Hannah had been sacrificed. I couldn't help but gag. The metallic smell of blood filling the air. I walked quietly towards the man's body, completely on edge. I peered into the room, prepared to run if I needed to. Inside, I found the bodies of several dozen men laying on the floor. I stepped around the top half of David's head, still sat in the puddle of blood by the doorway. My eyes avoided Hannah's lifeless corpse, her chest and stomach covered in blood. A crash from behind me nearly caused me to fall to the ground. I could hear a man cry in pain as he was likely ripped apart by the creature. I needed to leave. I sprinted through the doorway, ready to make a run for the entrance. I stopped suddenly, tripping on myself and falling to the floor. My head smacked against the floor as the black cloud of smoke floated into the room, seemingly in my direction. I pushed myself off the ground, my head spinning as I sprinted away from the creature. I remember heading down a familiar narrow hallway, my hands looking for a doorknob. I pushed my way into the library, slamming the door behind me. I stumbled deeper into the room, sure that I was going to die there. I was met with a gruesome sight as I moved down one of the aisles. The librarian laid on the ground, his stomach torn open, his intestines laid in a pile beside him, as if he had been cut open with a blade. Blood covered the floor, as well as the books on the lower two shelves on either side. I stepped past the man, unsure of where I was even going. I had been here before, and knew that there was no other exit, yet I moved as if I had thought there was another way. The sound of the library door flying open caught me off guard. As stupid as that sounds, I placed my back against the back corner of the library, preparing to meet this so-called God. It took my brain only a few seconds to recognize the sounds of footsteps. The man from my window stepped around one of the bookshelves, a look of distress in his eyes. "There you are," he said, stepping towards me with his arms outstretched. "Stay the hell away from me," I shouted, attempting to punch the man. He was much larger than I was. He caught my arm, holding it behind my back. "This isn't what David wanted, but I am merciful in the presence of the Lord," he said, pulling me away from the corner. "I will beg for his forgiveness on your behalf." I opened my mouth, stuttering in fear. "Please, just let me leave," I said, trying and failing to fight off the man. "It is almost over, child," he said, pushing me in the direction of the library's exit. This man, though intimidating as he was trying to help me in his final moments. At least, in his mind. "Let me go," I repeated, beginning to lose my strength. My head began to feel light, as it had when the Lord first arrived. "It is almost over," he said once more. "You can rest now." The man pushed me through the open doorway and down the narrow hallway into the large room with the tables. My eyes made direct contact with the monster as it hovered in the air above a man, seemingly choking on his own blood. My captor called out, startling me. "My lord," he said, suddenly stopping his movement. "I come pleading forgiveness." The cloud of smoke did not move, the man on the floor still struggling to breathe. "Your child has made a poor choice in turning his back on you. Please forgive him in his time of regret," the man from my window cried. I tried to speak, but the man had placed his arm against my throat. I found it difficult to breathe, let alone cry for help. The Lord began to float in my direction. My eyesight began to fade. Then I'm not sure if it was because of the creature or because the man was strangling me. Perhaps it was a mixture of both. I could see it now. The Lord. From this angle, I could see him. His face in the center of the cloud of smoke. I could barely make out the face of the man. The man had no mouth, no nose, his gray skin flat beneath his wide open eyes. Icy cold fear spread throughout my body. In my daze, my thoughts returned to Lily, Her beautiful eyes, her laugh, the kiss she had given me the last time I saw her. The creature floated in front of us for several seconds, its eyes burning into mine. The man cried out once more, "Please, my lord, forgive him and take him with us." The creature began floating towards me then. I began to move in a panic, wiggling in an attempt to escape the man's grasp. He was too strong. The face of the creature was too horrifying to look at. I turned my head, squinting my eyes shut as I waited for death. I felt a soft, cool sensation in my chest as the smoke made contact with my skin. A chill passed through my body as the creature moved closer. An overwhelming feeling of static began to form in my chest, as if electricity were being pumped into my heart. An odd feeling of peace passed over me. I opened my eyes, my entire body engulfed in a cloud of black smoke. The man's arm fell from my neck. A terrifying cry ripping through the air. I fell forwards, coughing from the smoke that had entered my lungs. I turned in time to witness the man hitting the floor, the back of his head smacking into the concrete. He cried out once more, his palms pressed against his temples. The man began to roll around on the floor, his cries becoming louder and higher in pitch. I watched in horror as he continued to move in this way, the creature hovering above him. A light crack pierced through the air. The man let out an amplified yelp, his continued screaming mixed with confusion. A second crack hit my ears, followed by the awful sound of the man's head caving in on itself. The pile of what was once the man's head plopped to the floor, his body continuing to spasm in its absence. My eyes returned to the creature. I hadn't noticed it turn to me. I began to scoot back, my fear reaching its peak. The Lord's eyes stared into my own for several moments. It could have been an hour for all I knew. The creature's hissing seemed to crescendo then, my hands moving to my ears. At some point, I had realized I could no longer see the creature's eyes through the smoke. Within a matter of seconds, the thick, black smoke dissipated into nothing. The hissing cutting off suddenly at its peak volume. I remember sitting on the floor of the basement for a long time after that creature vanished. A lot went through my mind then. I don't want to go over that information here. I doubt I could remember most of it anyways. It involved a lot of crying and a lot of crazy thoughts being let free. Once I had collected myself, I pushed myself from the floor and began to stumble my way towards the exit. What was I even going to do? Could I go to the police? What was I supposed to tell them? That my cult had been murdered by an evil spirit? Why had it spared me? I was met with a disturbing sight in the hallway that led to the exit. A large pile of men laid in the hallway. It appeared as if the men who had fled at the beginning of the event had not made it out. One man's head had been battered, it seemed. He must have been trampled. He got off easy, I suppose. The others, not so much. Many severed limbs could be found amongst the pile, the room stinking of blood and sweat. It pains me to type now, but I needed to get through that door. I set myself down on a man closest to me and began to pull myself across the top of the pile of men. Could I have walked? Probably, but I don't think I was comfortable standing on top of those men. I eventually reached the end of the hallway, my hand grasping the doorknob. Though my hand was slippery from the amount of blood I had just waded through, it wasn't hard to tell that the door was locked. The trek back to David's corpse was no better. I stood from the pile of corpses, my entire body soaked in blood. As I'd figured, I found a gold-colored key in David's pocket. I held it in my hands, having never felt happier to look at a piece of metal. Henry was still behind Hannah's corpse. I stared at his body for longer than I'd like to admit. His neck had been slit open. I had wondered if he had done it to himself. But I'd found the blade he had used to murder Hannah several feet away. I found it hard to find pity for my old friend. I knelt beside his body. Then, reaching into his bloody pockets, I fumbled around for a few moments, finally feeling my friend's set of car keys. I gave Hannah one final look before leaving. Sadness filled me. I barely knew the girl, but I just felt so bad. She trusted Henry, and he betrayed her. I trusted him too. I cried again as I stepped through the front doors of David's warehouse. There was nearly 100 cars in the parking lot today. I couldn't help but notice how many of them had those sticker families on the back of them. A father, a mother, a son, 2 daughters. A father, a mother, 2 sons, a dog, and a cat. I removed my clothing before stepping into Henry's car. Tears fell from my eyes again as I drove back to my apartment. I drove more carefully than I usually did. I didn't know what I would do if I had to explain to a police officer why I was driving completely naked with blood-soaked clothing in my trunk. Lily wasn't home when I arrived at the apartment. Thankfully, I popped open the trunk, quickly grabbed my clothing and sprinted inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The next hour was spent in the shower. Something about that water was so comforting to me. I didn't want to leave, but I needed to clean up the mess I had made. I threw my clothing into several trash bags, praying that nobody looked through them. It's not like anyone would want to. I was just being paranoid, I suppose. After throwing away my clothes, I sat on my couch in the living room and just stared at the ceiling for a while. My thoughts floated around my head the entire time, still unable to process what had happened to me. The time flew by. Lily was home before I expected. She was surprised when I hugged her as hard as I had, but she didn't complain. I remember floundering as she asked me about whose car was sat in the driveway. I ended up making up some crazy story about how Henry had loaned me his car for the day, as I hadn't been able to find my own set of keys that morning. Lily was obviously confused, but thankfully believed me. At least she let me believe that she did. I drove the car a few minutes away and left it on the side of the road in a quiet area. Someone would find it eventually. I was very thorough in checking the trunk for any signs of my blood. It looked like I'd be fine, but who knows anymore? I began the long walk back to the house, worried about being spotted by someone dangerous. As you could probably guess, the journey was very quiet. Nothing was out to get me anymore. I slept for a long time then. It was about 7 in the morning when I finally woke up. And here I am, sitting at my desk, talking to you. I haven't told Lily about what happened. I'm not sure I'm even going to yet. Probably not. I've started to reconsider my religious beliefs. Call me insane, I don't care. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. That much is sure. It didn't kill me. Whatever its motives, I owed that thing my life. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to fully recover from this, but I'm going to try. I have to, for Lily. You know, I'd thought this sub was just fiction, just stories. I'm going to be looking at life through a different pair of eyes from now on. That's for sure. Thanks to those of you who stuck around from the beginning, to those just finding this now, maybe you can learn a thing or two from my mistakes. I'm going to try to lay low for a while. I just hope I don't run into Warren any time soon.